combustion. And some people thought it was because one thing happened. Some people thought it was because another thing happened. I'm not going to go into all the various wild history of science examples here. People kept working on it. Eventually, they dropped one idea, and we have the kinetic theory of heat and combustion that we're still using today. Back in Newton's day, it appeared that space and time were uniform and stretched out indefinitely, that space and time could be mapped onto a basic Cartesian grid. In the aftermath of Einstein, it turns out that space isn't uniform, that it has to be mapped by a different geometry, and that at different places space gets reshaped by different amounts of mass and the gravitational relations that apply between them. People weren't sure about this in the 1910s, so they did things like measure shadows at the moment of eclipses to see if things were distorting the way Einstein predicted. And it turned out that they were. More recently, science, the NASA, I guess, sent clocks into outer space and moved them at rapid speeds, and it turned out when you brought them back to Earth that they were off by a couple of milliseconds from what would have been predicted. It's like Einstein is right again. On the other hand, Einstein just hated the Copenhagen theory of subatomic particles. The idea that you can't know either both where they are and what the vector forces involved are drove Einstein nuts. He thought that's got to be wrong, but over the last 100 years, it looks like something close to the Copenhagen interpretation with the uncertainty principle is going to be maintained. And who knows what's going to happen in the next 100 years. I tried to read a book on string theory. I was completely lost. And my math died, probably about 1918. And these guys are inventing new math to try to talk about new things, to get new ideas out there, which can now be circulated in the community and either accepted or ultimately rejected. In other words, that perfect deterministic thinker is a fiction.
And this is really does resonate with complexity, doesn't it, Scott? I mean, the way we've talked in this course a lot about different levels of stuff, right? The different, in a sense, I don't want to say reality so much, but I mean, your all's world as a student is different from my world as a faculty member, and yet we're co-evolving systems, and but you can't know, thinking about the universe, sort of bending and warping and all that, you can't know all the positions of all the particles from one position, right? That's sort of the idea of nonlinearity. It's not as if these different levels don't make sense. They make sense when you're at that level, right? But they don't make sense all at once.
The idea that you can reduce them all to a single level is what the contemporary scientific community has doubts about. Or
right.
At least what some people in the philosophy of science community have doubts about. Peirce was not a determinist. Peirce believed that chance was real. And as a result, things aren't predictable, even in the physical world, the way that those old-time 18th century cosmologists thought that they were. All that science needs, in other words, is regularity, habit. And Peirce, in another essay, argues that the laws of nature are just nature's habits becoming really, really, really dense. So for Peirce, there's only one substance. There's just the stuff that's in the world. The human part of that stuff is constantly changing, developing new ideas, working on new ways of understanding the world. Trees, on the other hand, they're pretty much doing the same thing that they've been doing for the last millennium. Not much interesting evolution in the pine tree recently.
Whereas there's much more chance, right, and unexpected sort of surprises following human beings and their thinking, right? Is that what we're getting at?
Exactly. And that's why when it gets to human beings, the complexity goes so far that your level of prediction drops accordingly.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there's no ability to predict humans, whether they be fundamentalists or college students or aging academics. Right? There's a good chance that we're all going to eat in the course of a day. There's a good chance that we're all going to drink something in the course of a day. But within those limits, the level of chance is fairly broad. I wouldn't even hazard to predict what any of you are going to eat today, although I might predict what most of you aren't going to eat today. I would guess that less than 10% of you will be eating armadillo.
Well, we got them here. Are you teasing us? Are you teasing us because we got armadillos around here? Is that what you're doing?
Hey, I've been there. I would imagine that 50% of us will consume a carbonated beverage of some sort. Now, whether it's a Coke or a Pepsi or a beer, I'm not going to hazard a guess. That's going to be more a function of the individual and unpredictable realities that occur as a function of real human chance.
But the bumps in the road, the sort of the more predictable stuff, and suspending for the moment the idea that chance is real and Peirce's contention that random stuff happens. I don't know if I can get my head around that so much, but I can understand the unpredictableness of things in practicality, you know, practically speaking. But what about the idea that, I mean, I like the idea that we're led in our thinking by what's socially important in our sort of landscape. And so fundamentalism in one part of the world and, well, fundamentalism in another part of the world. Here we are in the Bible Belt, and so there's a different kind of fundamentalism here than in, say, Iraq or what have you, Afghanistan. What's important there, what I like about Peirce's formulation is what's important there is relationships. And not, and it sounds almost anti-philosophy to say this, not the logic of the argument. So that people, there was a story on NPR yesterday or day before yesterday about how radicalization happens to, moderate, normal Muslim people in the West. They get radicalized, they're in London or they're in San Bernardino, California, through their relationships. It sort of sneaks in through family and through best friends, and that's why I think this is maybe particularly germane
Well, it's not only germane to the present, but it's equally important that we don't forget the fact that young Americans get radicalized. Now, they might not get as radicalized in 2015 as they did in 1965, but it was a similar process. So I, for example, think it might be fun to go hear a couple of bands that are playing in the park. And it turns out that these bands are supporting a particular political movement, let's say a get out of Vietnam movement. And so in the process of listening to the bands, I listen to the speeches from the radical student leaders. The speeches from the radical student leaders then create a certain sense of urgency there at the rally. And now I'm moving along with the other people around me, agreeing with those radicals. Even though had I been sitting at home just listening to the Grateful Dead on the stereo, I might not have been dragged into this radical movement. But once I'm in, then the pressures start to mount for me to conform, because, hey, I want to be accepted. I particularly want, the girl over there to accept me. And so when they say you've got to storm the Pentagon, maybe I'm more tempted than I might have been to storm the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm.
Or when somebody says, let's knock over a bank so that we can get some money, so that we can support this leftist movement and bring down the downfall of the oppressive white patriarchal government, I might say, yeah, okay, that sounds like a plan.
Because that's where your friend.
People who kidnapped Patty Hearst.
Yeah, I thought.
Radicalized the same way as the people who shot up San Bernardino.
The people who kidnapped Patty Hearst. I know. Well, funny. I was just thinking before he even said Patty Hearst. I was thinking about Patty Hearst herself getting radicalized, because I don't know if she fell in love with anybody in there, but there's the Stockholm syndrome, right, guys, of where you're kidnapped and you begin to identify with and love and appreciate, platonically your kidnappers, because you grow to understand them, you grow to know them so well, they become your best friends, your buddies. That's your contact with reality. And for Peirce, those are the people you're interacting with and talking with. And I don't know, so there's something happening there.
And the fact that you mentioned Stockholm Syndrome, I think, is important, Lauren, because what I don't want to say, and what Peirce certainly doesn't want to say, is that there is no place for theory in understanding human action. There's plenty of room for theory in understanding human action, just as there's room for theory in understanding marine biology. But part of what we have to do is to make sure that we don't see our theories as deterministic mechanisms. Somebody who was kidnapped but had a different background, maybe different expectations than Patty Hearst, might not have gone into that Stockholm phase as rapidly, or might have gone into it even more rapidly. Somebody who got into it more rapidly, spent more time with the Symbionese Liberation Army, might never have come out. Patty, after she was liberated, I guess, ultimately devolved back into a nice, rich, upper middle class girl, and I guess married some nice, rich, upper middle class guy. I lost track of Patty a long time ago.
Yeah.
But all of these things, even though the theory is helpful in understanding her behavior, that theory isn't a machine that can crank out the same predictions for any individual that you toss into it.
No,
so
but
theory is always pragmatic and malleable.
Right. But I think where, the social science perspective on this and sociology with predicting general trends is you never try and predict an individual's behavior. You try and predict the rate of individuals behaving in that kind of setting. So you wouldn't say that everybody's going to fall in love with their captors or anything like that. And for those that don't, and this is more my important point about chance is real. For those that don't, there's going to be a reason for that. Different reasons, but there will be reasons for that.
Exactly right. But notice that the sociologists, as you've described them, and the scientists, as I've been trying to describe them, are at odds with Descartes and Laplace. Descartes and Laplace would have wanted to say that if we can know all of the details, then we really can grind out the predictions as if it were in a machine. The 21st century thinkers, both social and natural, have been influenced by this pragmatic tradition that's not unique to Peirce and to the American pragmatist tradition, but is a particular strand that was a minority strand in European philosophy until the 19th century, and has now become, in many ways, if not a minority strand, one that is on an equal footing with the foundationalists.
So they're not to overly to be overly generous towards Laplace or anything, but he wouldn't have said, you don't think, Scott, you're misrepresenting me. When I say understand everything, I mean everything. And you're short selling it by saying, oh, well, you don't know about what's happened over there because you limited it to this, and he could sort of have that last word.
Well, I think that the reality of chance, the uncertainty of our claims to knowledge, and the malleability of humans makes it impossible for anybody to know everything.
Yes, but that's why his argument was hypothetical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he still believed that guy, if he could get that information, could know it. I just don't believe that information is ever really there to be got.
Yeah. Well, unless you're omniscient, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, should we let the guys back in? Any questions yet?
Well, remember that's next class that we're ending early, Scott.
I understand. I'm perfectly happy to keep going on. I just wanted to give them a break if they wanted to get their 2 cents in.
Oh, I thought you meant, dismiss them. We want to give them their money's worth, of course, so we've never dreamed of doing anything like that. Yeah. Guys, any questions or comments or anything?
Well, let me move forward then in some further aspects of Peirce on inquiry. So we've moved from verbal behavior to language to thinking to the systematic pursuit of thinking that Peirce calls inquiry. Inquiry for Peirce begins when we encounter a puzzle. And that puzzle means that we don't know how to go on. Now, when we don't know how to go on, there's this sense of uncertainty and unease because we want to move forward, and we want to move forward in a way that will successfully capture the situation as it is. So inquiry for Peirce is the attempt to settle opinion and remove doubt. But Peirce notes, and this is in one of those later essays, if you want bibliographical information, I'll be happy to pass it on later. It turns out that there are 4 ways of settling doubt. You can just hold on in spite of the evidence. You can say, I don't believe it. I don't think that really happened. And then you can continue on the way that you were going before the doubt happened. Or you can appeal to authority. I know that it happened this way because my authority says so. Those first two ways, what Peirce calls tenacity and authority, are notably present in fundamentalists of a variety of sorts. Right? Whether it be the American fundamentalist or the Jewish fundamentalist or the Muslim fundamentalist, that person wants to say, I know where authority lies, and I'm not going to follow you. I know what's really real, and I can discount you. A third way of settling doubt is what Peirce calls the method of the a priori, the idea that certain things are essentially true, that there must be a deterministic explanation for everything, that there must be a certain foundation for all claims. Peirce wants to say, where did this a priori come from? It came from humans, and we already know that humans are contingent in time and place, and that their thinking is contingent in time and place. So just because we always believed that the natural world should be deterministic isn't by itself a reason to think so. Why should it be deterministic? We can tell it's regular, but we can also tell that if you perform the same experiment over and over and over, you're not going to get the same results. There's always going to be some variation. The a priori determinist wants to say that variation is just a function of our fragile instruments and our inability perfectly to reproduce our actions. And Peirce is going to say, well, why should that be true? Why can't it be the case that just, sometimes some things happen and sometimes different things happen? Most of the time it's pretty regular, but regularity and determinism are not the same thing. Regular just means that, habitually speaking, 9 times out of 10, I'll get up after 5 o'clock in the morning. Now, if I have to, I'll get up at 4:30. That's a really ugly thought. I don't want to do it. So I'm regular, but there's nothing deterministic about it. And in fact, Peirce says that the only method that's likely to give us truth in inquiry is the method of actual scientists, who admit that there are real things in the world, whose characteristics are independent of our opinions about them, and that these things interact in a regular way. And as a matter of fact, interact in a lot of different regular ways. And by using our intellectual skills, we can come to understand the way that these things are. Not certainly, and not deterministically, but in terms of the regular patterns of action and reaction that are predictable parts of our natural and social worlds. And notice that the level of predictability might be high when it comes to chemical reactions in standard laboratory experiments, right? You put the salt into the water, and pretty much you're going to get sodium and chlorine ions? Sometimes not, right? If you take X number of grains of salt, are they all going to dissolve? Probably not. Could you have predicted which ones were going to dissolve and which ones weren't? Probably not. If you put a couple of electrodes in there, you can move those ions around and they'll behave in predictable ways, but sometimes you're going to get surprised. And if we move from chemical reactions to biological reactions, the level of uncertainty is going to get even stronger. Right? So if I poke my electrode into frog A, I might get one reaction. If I poke it into frog B, I might get a somewhat different reaction. And as we move further on down the scale, if I poke my electrode into Professor Demarath, I might get one reaction. He punches me in the nose. If I put my electrode into, I don't know, my vaguely strange friend Peter, he might like the sensation and say, please, do it again. The more we get into general human responses, the more uncertain they're going to be. Because humans, unlike chemicals and unlike trees mostly, are able to revise both their desires and expectations. An example that I like to bring up, capsaicin is the active ingredient in chili peppers and that whole family of green peppers. And the concentration of capsaicin differs for different species of chili peppers. So if you take your jalapeno, it's going to have less of that capsaicin than your habanero. And before the European encounter with the New World, those peppers weren't used in the cuisine of the rest of the world. But within 200 years, you had some people using them for some styles of cooking in China, other people using them for different styles of cooking in the Philippines and in East Asia, yet different styles of preparation in Europe. Keep in mind that paprika didn't exist before the 16th or 17th century. And now you can get different kinds of paprikas in different qualities, and they make different tastes. And then people respond to those tastes in different ways. I had a wife once who couldn't stand anything that was spicy. Too bad for that. I love the stuff. I love the feeling of getting hot there on my forehead and little beads of sweat, and then that strange, exciting tingle there on the back of the tongue. But that doesn't mean that so-and-so's going to like it, because we're brought up with different standards, both of taste, expectation, desire, interpretation. Earlier this morning, Professor Demarath and I and several other people were talking about Durkheim. Durkheim is an late 19th, early 20th century sociologist. He was actually trained as a straightforward philosopher. I think he wrote his dissertation on Kant, I'm not sure. And Durkheim asked the question, how do societies keep themselves from falling apart? And at least part of his answer was that they develop, out of their language and out of their experience, sets of communal actions that they take to be special. And he makes a distinction between the sacred and the profane. So most of the year we're out in the bush just hunting and gathering and doing what primitive societies do. But at special times of the year, we come together and we interact with each other in very well-established ways. And by interacting in those ways, we reaffirm our solidarity with each other, and we experience that overflowing or effervescence, that communal sense of oneness that we get when we satisfactorily complete a ritual. And it doesn't matter at some level whether we're talking about the rituals of native Australians, that's who Durkheim was mostly working on, or the bizarre rituals of 21st century Americans at Thanksgiving, where you come together, you expect a meal. Do there have to be certain components to that Thanksgiving meal?
Yes.
And if those components aren't there, are you going to be dissatisfied?
Yes.
And so everybody makes sure that all of those things get put in there. Some people are going to, change things up every now and then. And maybe one of those changes hooks on, maybe it doesn't. If somebody wants to watch ballet after Thanksgiving dinner on television, what's the response going to be?
Okay.
Probably not. What are we going to watch?
What?
We'll watch football games. Right? And Uncle George is going to fall asleep on the sofa, and we're going to have to roll him over to keep him from snoring. But this is what we do every Thanksgiving, and when we do these things, it reinforces our sense of being the people that we are. One of the things that contributes to radicalization is that certain individuals aren't incorporated into those social rituals, and thus they're left out. And being left out creates dissonance. That dissonance can result in ennui, in a feeling of lassitude and being unrelated to anything, or it can result in seeking an alternative social world. That's what the radical is doing.
And by the way, these guys all know, because they took intro sociology, anomie, which is normlessness, right? And Durkheim talked about these peasants that are coming into the city and they're going to be totally lost and they're going to commit suicide unless maybe they're Catholic, a little bit less of that. And sure enough, that's what he found. So yeah, ties into that.
And Durkheim was one of the great social theorizers of the history of sociology. When you mix him together with his German compatriot Max Weber, you have someone who's interested in how things change over time. So Weber wanted to study the way in which capitalism affected certain kinds of social norms. And it turned out that by a strange set of movements, we go from Calvin's theory of double predestination to the incredible wealth of Andrew Carnegie. How we make that trip is a long and complicated story. But all of these things contribute to trying to understand both the natural world and the human world. And from this pragmatist position that I've been arguing, they are legitimate contributions to knowledge, but they shouldn't be taken as deterministic machines that are going to grind out any kind of certain large-scale, predictable truths.
Scott, can I ask a question here with regard to Peirce's those means of resisting agreement, right? And you talked about you hold on in spite of the evidence, you appeal to authority, or you cite some a priori essential truths, right? And was that it? Was that those three?
Those three are the ones that typically fail, as opposed to what Peirce calls the ordinary method of science, which is going to give you the best chance of satisfying your doubt. Think of it this way. Tenacity is only going to get you so far. If you keep saying that the earth is flat, the evidence is ultimately going to overwhelm you, and you will either have to acquiesce or you're gonna get left behind. I may have used this example last time I was meeting with you guys. My father had a wife once who insisted that the earth was flat. And he would say, well, what about those pictures from satellites? And she'd say, oh, they did that in the TV studio. And he would say, but what about what the astronauts see when they go up in space? That was all done in the studio. You mean that Neil Armstrong walking on the moon never happened? By that time, they were divorced, so I don't know what she would have said about that. But my guess is she would either have had to have acquiesced, or she would have been left behind.
And
Left behind.
I think, Scott, the thing about relationship leading to radicalization here is that she would have either found people that support her point of view, or she would have come on board. But she wouldn't have gone it alone, I would think. And
that I don't know. There's a famous book, I'm sure that you know it, Lauren, but the students might enjoy it. It's written in the 1950s by two guys whose names I now forget. But it's called When Prophecy Fails. And this was a study of space cults. I think the first one was in Ohio, and then it was in Denver, and then, like all other things of that sort, it ends up in Los Angeles. And these are people who believed that the spaceship was coming, and it was going to solve their problems and take it away, and take them away. And they predict that it's going to happen on October 22nd, 1956. Does it happen? No. Some of the people leave the group, but others of the group say, oh, it must have been because we didn't believe hard enough. And so if we only believe better,
that's right, and it gets stronger, right?
The spaceship will come.
And the
so
belief
is forced to, create further solidarity, insist on the centrality of practices. When that doesn't happen, some people cap off, but new people are coming in. And even a larger example of this are what are called the cargo cults of Melanesia in the first, maybe 2/3 of the 20th century.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, Leon Festinger, right?
Festinger, that's who.
Festinger, he's the father of cognitive dissonance theory. You all know that. A lot of these people are psych majors in here, so they know that. I also want to throw in, by the way, if you guys want a fun novel that has sociologists as the main characters, and who wouldn't want that, right? It's called Imaginary Friends by Alison Lurie. Alison Lurie is a great novelist of our era a little bit. Scott, you might know her, but it's called Imaginary Friends. It's about the same thing. She's researching this cult that thinks UFOs are coming. They don't come, and what happens. But I think we here in Shreveport in the South, we hear people when